From the New Arts and Media Studios in Milwaukee, I'm Charles Purcell. This is The Log. And as always, so much to get to. We'll see what we can squeeze into this short 29-minute program. First of all, I have to acknowledge the birthday of former President Jimmy Carter. It was on September 29th, Sunday. Happy birthday, 100 years, 100th anniversary of the birth of the greatest ex-president ever to live. And for all of the grief he gets, a good president. He was a decent man. He was the only, maybe the only genuinely kind, decent, moral person to ever occupy that office. I was so proud to vote for him. My first vote, I turned 18 years old in 1976, in March of that year. And in November of that year, I got to vote for the first time. And I was very excited. I'd been following politics since I was very young, since I was, 63, 4, 2, I forget, when was Kennedy assassinated? That was my first, that was when I was first aware of politics, and I was about 5. Yes, so back to the point. I was very excited to vote at the age of 18. I've been waiting for, 10 years and looking forward to that. And just so proud to cast my first vote for Jimmy Carter. And that never waned. To this day, I'm proud of that vote and proud of that man. He's a great man. I got to meet him once, and it was just after his presidency. So I was 23 or 4, something like that. So still pretty young. I was totally tongue-tied when I met him. I couldn't come up with anything to say except, thank you. I remember saying thank you. He was very kind. It was great experience. And I'll forever hold him in my heart. He's a great, great man. Turned 100 years old on Sunday, September 29th. His grandson, I think, is quoted as saying that his grandfather wants to live long enough to vote for Kamala Harris. Early voting in Georgia starts in a couple of weeks, so looks like he's going to make it, and I'm happy about that. Of course, he's been in hospice care for quite a while. And, the other thing about Jimmy Carter, too, this sort of really very bittersweet notion in American history, his loss to Ronald Reagan was just so transformative. It's like America flipped a switch. From our very founding, there were fights among the founding fathers about pro-slave and pro-abolition, and those who differed regarding states' rights and federal, sort of individual versus the collective. That's always been with us. And, of course, it's reared its ugly head a few times. Civil War, of course, being the greatest example, but it's just an underlying current that was always there. There've always been the right-wing radical, there've been the Birchers. So the divisions have always been there. But one of those big moments, and the one we live with to this day, it was when Ronald Reagan crushed Jimmy Carter. And America sort of decided what it wanted to be. And ever since then, it's been this really steady decline, kind of a rapid decline, into just right-wing mania. And, Ronald Reagan, you just draw a direct line from Ronald Reagan to Newt Gingrich and the Tea Party and the whole bit, all the way to Trumpism and our current state of affairs where fascism is just rearing its ugly head. And those of us in 1980 who were shouting these warnings, we were shouting from the rooftops, you cannot elect this Hollywood buffoon who's just a mouthpiece and, what's the term I'm looking for? Oh, useful idiot. Yeah, Ronald Reagan was a useful idiot for that whole movement. The Birchers and the bigots and the right-wingers really found their power. And the whole lie of trickle-down economics, and they've sung the same song ever since, Republicans. We heard it just the other night in the debate, in the vice presidential debate, deregulate and cut taxes. They've just had the same answer ever since. And of course, then you get the whole social conservative side and the evangelicals and the book banners and the people who invent issues and then run on them, like Willie Horton and welfare queens. And this current crop of right-wingers are very good at inventing problems and then running on them. The aforementioned book banners, blaming immigrants for virtually everything under the sun. But again, this sort of really took hold. Again, a straight line from 1980 election of Ronald Reagan. And again, we were all warning. It's like this is the first step toward fascism. And we were just laughed at. We were mocked for being alarmists and being overreactionaries. But we've been proven over and over, time and time again, to be right. I mean, look where we are. Again, straight line. Reagan, Gingrich, Tea Party, MAGA. So at the anniversary of Jimmy Carter's birth, happy 100th birthday to the last good, decent person who represented our nation. And as much as I hate to admit it, I hate to admit this, but it matters. It really, really matters who's president. I don't want that to be true. I've said many times, and I'll repeat it right now, I think the president, the office itself, should be weakened drastically. I think that person's role should be, as described in the Constitution, to execute the laws. It's up to Congress to pass the laws. It's up to Congress to fund everything. It's up to the courts to mete out justice when it comes to the criminal justice system, but also to interpret the law, especially when you get all the way up to SCOTUS. There are defined responsibilities for each branch of government. And the way I read the Constitution, and the way it, after a couple of 250 years of doing this, it seems like we've got the presidency wrong. That the president has to have all this power, not only in the government, but power over our psyche. That's what I mean when I say the president has way too much power, way too much influence. It's like they talk about the sports analogy. They talk about a team taking on the personality of the coach. And for those who know a lot about sports, they fall back on this a lot. So, they seem to know what they're talking about. I see it in my long years. Again, I started following this when I was like 5. The nation does take on the characteristics, the personality of the president. If I could wave my magic social anarchist wand, the president would just do their job like a good public servant. They wouldn't be this philosopher king, wouldn't be this great sort of supersized celebrity that half the nation wants to hate and half the nation wants to sanctify. It's gotten so ridiculous. So I wish that wasn't the case. But the fact is, Jimmy Carter was the last president, in my mind, to be truly admirable, a very, very good and moral and decent person. And his greatest accomplishment, of course, he had small accomplishments. The economy got the best of him, but presidents have almost no power over the economy, which you and I need to talk about some more. He put in 1970 something, he put solar panels on the roof of the White House. I mean, come on. If we had stayed on that trajectory, I interrupted myself. His greatest accomplishment, of course, the Middle East. He just did fantastic things about the Middle East. There was no president, no politician, no public servant, no American in my lifetime who was more expert on Middle East policy and more successful in implementing American persuasion for the good. And just to have him rejected in 1980 for the likes of Ronald Reagan and to head down the horrible path we've headed for the last 45 years is just sad. And you can't overstate the regret we ought to have about that. So, happy birthday, Jimmy Carter. Last note, shame on the national media for just ignoring it. I imagine it got a couple of mentions in the news, a little 10-second mention. There should have been tributes. There should have been 2-hour network specials. There should have been documentaries and celebrations and fireworks and concerts. There should have been a celebration of this man's life at 100. We should have just stopped everything and just shown him all the love. And that didn't happen because we don't live in that country anymore. All right. Israel. Okay. Switching topics here. Well, speaking of Jimmy Carter, like I said, too bad he's not around when we need him. The news is moving way too fast for me to do it any justice right here. Iran, obviously, as you know, if you're following the news at all, they're tossing missiles, and Israel has lost some soldiers. You know, when hundreds of people die at a time, when hundreds of people in Gaza and Lebanon and the West Bank, they're just falling every single day. And then we get these big headlines. Oh, 8 Israeli soldiers die. The double standard is just shocking. Anyway, yeah, you know the stories. Missiles are flying. Israel's Iron Dome is mostly holding. Everybody's concerned that it's going to escalate even more. So it's all moving too fast for me to do it any justice right now. But I will say this, and I want to say this today. I will always side with the oppressed rather than the oppressors. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, but it ain't hard to tell the difference here. Israel has been the oppressor now for decades. You know, maybe in 1948 when they were the little state that could, and they had all these hostile players around them and they needed protection. Yeah, maybe for the first 10 years or so, they were, the little state that could. I've said before, without apology, it was a dumb idea to put them there in the first place. The collective worldwide guilt over the Holocaust. So it was all well-intentioned, but it was just a really dumb idea to establish Israel on that particular patch of land, displacing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. It was just crazy. But, okay, we can't go back to 1948. Here's where we are. But for several decades now, Israel has been the oppressor. People in Gaza and people in the West Bank have been the oppressed. There's been genocide. There's been colonial genocide. So, yeah, I'm always going to be with the oppressed and not with the oppressors. Think of it, here's the analogy here's how I think about it. Hamas and Hezbollah. It's supposed to just be common knowledge, accepted fact that they are these heinous terrorist organizations. My analogy here is that Hamas and Hezbollah are like gangs in a neighborhood, okay? And when they attack, it's analogous to, riots in a neighborhood. That is, the underprivileged, the people who are getting the worst of it in a city, the cops are harassing them. They don't have social services like they ought to. They don't have economic opportunities like they ought to. And it gets bad. And then something happens, somebody is killed, and there's something that sparks a riot, and all of a sudden then all the blame is put on these rioters, or there's gang violence, all the blame is put on these gangs as though they were just born bad. When there are all these elements, these fundamental elements that gave rise to the gangs and gave rise to the unrest and gave rise to the riots. Now, am I condoning riots? Of course not. Am I condoning gangs? Of course not. I'm acknowledging their origins. That's all. And if you take this analogy from a neighborhood or city level to an international level, that's what Hamas and Hezbollah are. They're basically gangs. And they're only there because of the conditions that gave rise to them. It's the reaction to oppression. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, a riot is the language of the unheard. Remember that quote? I'll say it again. A riot is the language of the unheard. It doesn't excuse the riot. It doesn't condone the riot. It acknowledges where this is coming from. And if I could push this analogy just a little bit further. Now, for me, in this analogy, Iran is the bad actor, just like some neighborhood criminal kingpin who takes advantage of the situation. By embracing these street kids, by funding and exploiting street gangs. Iran is the bad actor exploiting the situation, embracing and funding Hamas and Hezbollah for their own nefarious purposes. Okay, that's the end of my analogy. but that's the way I see it. And that's why I can't get behind Israel. For my money, they're just on a murder spree at this point. The war crimes are incalculable at this point. The international community, the United Nations, every civilized nation on this earth has condemned them for their war crimes. Israel, they are the bad guy. They've been the oppressor. They've had their boot on the neck of Palestinians for 50 years. And so when there are uprisings and when there's violence and when there's rock throwing, now you use that as an excuse to wipe out entire people. And when Iran, their sponsor, exploiting the situation, gets involved, now you got a full-on war. All of this was preventable, and all of it can end with a ceasefire and diplomacy. There are oppressors and there are oppressed. And there are reasons. They don't justify violence. No one here condones violence. I certainly do not condone violence ever, and I never will. But if you don't acknowledge its origins, you can't ever do anything about it except continue to engage in this vicious, violent cycle. That's all. So, Israel can do it with a snap of a finger. Israel can just stop. Just say no more. Just stop. Ceasefire now. Just declare it. But they won't do it, of course. But they can. They have the power. They have all the power to do this. The power dynamic is just crazy. I got to talk a little bit about Hurricane Helene. Once again, you don't need me to hear the news. You got all the news that you ever need to hear on this. I'm going to take a step back and just say what I've been saying ever since the San Francisco earthquake of 1989. There's no such thing as a natural disaster. Almost every time there is a natural disaster, you can point to social reasons and economic reasons why some people are hurt and some people aren't. Many stark examples. The poorest people hurt the most. The kind of forbidden thought that I dare not even express. I couldn't help while all this was unfolding thinking about Ron DeSantis and the other red state governors and mayors who want to deny climate change, and then this hits them. Again, I wish no ill on anyone, especially innocent citizens of these red states. But damn, talk about capital K karma for these just rabid right-wingers who literally take any mention, forget about the funding. They don't even want to acknowledge that it exists. They take any mention out of legislation. They actually pass laws that you can't use the word climate change. You can't study it. You just can't do anything about it. So, just crazy. And then this story, oh my God, the story of this plastics factory, Impact Plastics. I've seen different reports. 2 dead. Another headline said 3. One said 4 missing still. An earlier headline, there were 10 missing. Anyway, workers at this Tennessee plastics factory, they said they weren't allowed to leave until it was too late. The parking lot and the roads heading out of this place were already covered with water. They were already starting to flood. So some people got out. A lot of people didn't. A lot of people were trapped. A few killed, many missing. I guess a few found since then. But just, oh my God, such a damning story of this this Impact Plastics specifically, but of capitalism generally. I can say personally, I've had jobs where I've had bosses tell me, and I live in Wisconsin, right? I live where it snows. I've had bosses tell me when the weather service is saying, this is a snow emergency, stay home, don't go out. I've had bosses tell me that if I don't show up for work, I'm fired. I've had that personal experience, and I'll bet you have too. Or I'll bet if you haven't, your neighbor or somebody in your family has. Yeah, I've been literally told that in a snow emergency. I say, look, the weather service says I shouldn't drive. Oh, it's not that bad. Really, I don't want to come in. Well, you have to. If you don't come in today, just don't come in at all. I've had that more than once. Off the top of my head, I can think of 3 different employers who told me that exact same thing. So this is the world we live in, right? Yeah, Hurricane Helene. Man. No time today to get to the vice presidential debate. That's okay because you didn't miss anything. I'll just leave you with this. In and of itself, the debate, not really important. It's a vice presidential debate, doesn't mean too much. The biggest takeaway I had, for all of his faults, and he's got plenty, J.D. Vance isn't dumb. Nobody's ever accused him of being stupid. He's a smart guy. And he knows that he's hated. He knows that his favorables, as they call them, are way underwater. And so he invented this role. He played a new role where he was this sort of very smooth, nice, almost cordial kind of a guy. He said nice things about Tim Walz, and they agreed about a few things. And he kind of suckered Tim Walz into it. Walz kind of got knocked off his feet, and he sort of joined him a few times. So the whole thing, most of it was kind of pretty cordial, pretty friendly. And several times they agreed on things. So Vance had quite a successful night in creating this new character, and he played it very well. And he totally hid. The real J.D. Vance is pretty easy to find. He's been doing podcasts for the last 10 years. He wrote a really kind of racist, weird book. And every day out on the campaign trail, he says worse and worse things, and the whole migrants eating cat stuff. And, he's a genuinely weird kind of tech bro, hedge fund, neo-Nazi weirdo. We spent a good long segment on this program breaking down his convention speech here in Milwaukee, where it was soaking in blood and soil philosophy and rhetoric, just straight up neo-Nazi, frightening kind of rhetoric. So we know who he is. We got miles and miles of tape of him on podcasts and giving speeches. He's really the worst of the worst. And here he appeared very reasonable, very normal, not weird at all. Of course, he lied like a psychopath. That was really the frightening thing. He was able to lie so effectively, and so the lies just slide out of his mouth so easily. It's frightening. It's like his superpower. I mean, only a psychopath can lie like that, and he was lying about just literally everything. On the other side, Tim Walz, he did kind of a similar thing in the fact that he ditched one persona for another. He ditched the dad, folksy coach, nice person for the most part. He was just appeared to be a very well-prepared and knowledgeable public servant. He was just reeked with normality. He started out kind of nervous, which is almost endearing. He was obviously nervous, but he found his feet pretty quickly. The issues that they were asked about, let's see, I'm looking at the clock here. I don't have time to get into all of this, but Israel and Iran, they both kind of punted on that one. J.D. Vance had an interesting, he was subtle about it, but he basically promoted the madman theory without calling it that. He danced around it, but it was pretty obvious. And he and the Orange Menace have said this in various ways over the last, several months. The madman theory, basically that the Orange Menace is so crazy and so unhinged that the rest of the world is literally frightened of him, and they don't know what the hell he's capable of doing. And so it kind of gets them in line. And they use that, and it might be the one argument that I kind of agree with them on. I mean, to a certain extent, it does work. Migrants are scared as hell to try to cross Trump's border because they don't know what he's capable of. He'll just shoot them. He tells border agents to break the law. That's all right. I'll pardon you. I'll ignore it. I'll get my appointed judges to look the other way. Rip babies out of mothers' arms. I'll do it. And on the international level, when it comes to Iran and dropping the bomb and blah, 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 whatever, they don't know what the hell he's capable of doing. Yeah, the Orange Menace, that's maybe his strongest argument, the madman theory. But, I don't want to live in that world. I don't know about you. I don't want to live in that world. Talked about climate, immigration, Again, JD lied, blamed immigrants for literally every problem in the world. All lies. Vance pulled out the whole Harris has been in office for 3.5 years. Why hasn't she done any of this? Ignoring the fact that she's vice president. Maybe he should look in a civics book and find out what his job is going to be if he wins. By the way, they never call her Harris. They always call her Kamala. Two things wrong with that. They mispronounce the name intentionally, which is just pure bigotry. That's just all. There's nothing you can call that. But that's just hate and bigotry when you intentionally mispronounce someone's name. And the misogyny of calling her by her first name. No one ever called Clinton Bill. Nobody called Obama Barack. Nobody ever called Bush George. Nobody ever called the Orange Menace Donald. And by the way, if you notice some irony there, yeah, I'm completely aware that my calling the Orange Menace not by his name is disrespectful. Yeah, I know it is. Yeah, that's my intention. It's my absolute intention. And when they say Kamala, that is their absolute intention, to be bigoted and disrespectful intentionally. It's both misogynistic and it's bigoted. So there you go. That's who they are. The only time Walz got the best of Vance, I mean, he got the best of him on actual facts and policy all night long. That wasn't even close. It was just boom, 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 massacre when it comes to the facts. But, of course, most of the nation doesn't know truth from fiction. And on style points, Vance did great. And the right-wingers and the right-wing media just thrilled with his performance, and all just, the headlines are about how he crushed Walz. So that's disheartening, but that's the world we live in. I was going to say the last couple of points of the night, Walz, he did score some points, even stylistically, on abortion and the issues of democracy on January 6th. Vance was kind of back on his heels, and Walz scored some points there. And a couple of Vance's attempts on gun control were just comically weird. Like, his solution was to make doors and windows lock better on schools. There were a couple of things that were pretty laughable that literally everybody heard. It didn't matter your affiliation. And then the biggest highlight in that regard was what he said about January 6th and how the Orange Menace transferred power peacefully, and he completely whitewashed the January 6th thing. And Walz got him pretty good on that. And Vance's attempted defenses were comically bad. I heard one number that 58% of independents thought Walz won the debate. So I guess that's something to hang your hat on. All right. Well, way up against the clock, way late here. Got to go. All right. There it is. This episode and all episodes can be found at the website, charlespurcell.com, or on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks to River West Radio, our flagship terrestrial station, riverwestradio.com. Contact me, Charles Purcell, at Gmail. Follow on Facebook. Thanks to Peter Donalds, who wrote and performed the theme song. All right, there it is. Love you. See ya.